They literally had the public in the city of Detroit terrorized.
Between 1925 and 1932, over 500 murders go unsolved in Detroit. Most are attributed to the Purple Gang. From hijacking liquor, the Purples extend their violent reach and muscle in on Detroit's speakeasy business. Seize control of the illegal distilleries and distribution throughout the city, and take over the river and control the movement of alcohol from Canada. In 1927, at the height of the Purple Gang's power, over 500,000 cases of liquor are smuggled across the Detroit River.
Typically what they would do is when they would get a bottle of Canadian liquor, they would cut it. They'd make 3 or 4 bottles out of it. And there were cutting plants all over the city. It was just a process of watering down the alcohol, adding coloring to it, adding a few other different types of chemicals to make it look like the real thing, and then putting tickets on it, which were false labels.
The Purple Gang distributes their liquor to gangsters throughout the entire country. One of their customers is none other than public enemy number 1, Alphonse Scarface Capone. A Brooklyn, New York native, Capone heads west in 1921. He quickly takes over the illegal liquor trade in Chicago and rules the town with a combination of brutal savagery and shrewd marketing. Next, Capone sets his sights on Detroit.
Capone was a very astute businessman. And in 1927, he came to Detroit with the idea of opening up a franchise, and he sat down and had a meeting with the 4 Bernstein brothers, and they essentially told him that river belongs to us. Anything that moves across that river, you either deal with us, or you just don't have any business in Detroit. So Capone realized that a gang war with the Purples here in Detroit was a losing proposition.
Capone aligns himself with the Purples, and together they take bootlegging and violence to a new level. Their brutality culminates in one of the bloodiest slaughters in Prohibition history. Bugs Moran, leader of the rival Northside Gang in Chicago, hijacks a load of Purple Gang whiskey intended for Capone. Seeking revenge, Capone orchestrates a trap.
Supposedly, a freelance hijacker had called Moran and told him he had a really bargain basement shipment of liquor for him. Well, Moran, who couldn't turn down a good deal, said okay. Supposedly, Abe Bernstein, the reputed leader of the Purple Gang, had made that phone call.
The trap is set. The bogus shipment of liquor is to be delivered to Moran at a warehouse in Chicago on February 14, 1929. When the Northside Gang arrives, Purple gangsters hidden across the street call in the hitmen. Disguised as police, the killers enter the warehouse pretending to raid. As they line the Northside gangsters against the wall, 2 additional hitmen enter the warehouse with Thompson submachine guns and open fire. It will go down in history as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Although it is well known that Capone orchestrated the slaughter, few know that the Purple Gang was directly involved.
The Purple Gang was really never implicated in it. 3 Purple gangsters were positively identified, but nothing was ever done. It just kind of faded into oblivion.
Ironically, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre misses the intended target. Bugs Moran is late to the meeting and narrowly avoids his death sentence. Still, the carnage sends shockwaves through the country, a painful reminder of the violence and lawlessness created by the 18th Amendment. During Prohibition, organized crime groups like the Purple Gang helped drive up the homicide rate by nearly 80%. The number of federal convicts rises by over 500%.
The country was fed up of prohibition. Gangsters were taking over cities. Gangsters were taking over police forces. There was far more violence in the streets. It obviously wasn't working.
Soon, many of the staunchest moral crusaders realize prohibition has backfired.
The 18th Amendment has delivered this nation bound hand and foot to organized crime. We believe that the 18th Amendment has failed, and failed badly. I'm a reformed prohibitionist myself. I hoped it was going to work. I'm forced to admit that it has not.
Well-intended people who felt that prohibition would bring a new moral tone to America created the very problem that they were trying to suppress or eliminate.
In 1933, President Roosevelt signs the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, repealing prohibition and ending the 13-year drought.
Hardwired. Now, my point is this. My mother lived through prohibition of alcohol. She passed away a couple years ago. She was a very bright woman, a nurse anesthetist, World War II vet in Africa. She looked at me in her latter years and said, you know, this war on drugs is identical to the prohibition of alcohol. Now, here's a woman that lived and saw both. And she said, all they're doing is creating criminals' wealth, because criminals like Al Capone got wealthy during the prohibition of alcohol, and criminals like Pablo Escobar are getting wealthy today because of the prohibition of drugs. How do you answer that?
Prohibition is a hard policy. It's a tough policy. But the problem with drugs in this country isn't about one policy or another. It's about drug use. It's about drug addiction. There are 7 million Americans right now with a clinically diagnosable addiction to drugs. The costs that has to society are staggering. Healthcare costs, education costs, violent crime,
and that's
all
how
these things.
Staggering it is, Tom, to have to pay the prices for these illegal drugs. You don't see people out holding people up to get their next drink. You don't see people out sticking up the 7-Eleven store to buy a pack of smokes. But when they're addicted to these other substances, the price goes through the roof because they're illegal, and therefore they have to commit other crimes to support their addiction.
Most of the violence that's associated with drugs is people who are on drugs, not drug trafficking. Drug trafficking is a crime. That's what prohibition's about. But the thing that drives it is that most of the violent crime that's committed, or most of the crime period that's committed having to do with drugs, is people who are on drugs committing violent crimes. If you make it legal, if you make it cheaper, you make it more available, you're going to have more violence, more
Tom,
addiction,
that is
more
not
crime.
true. Stop lying to us.
Oh, now come on.
Stop lying to us. That is not true. You know, don't tell me that. I've smoked pot, Tom. I've admitted it. I've done it. I've done all of the big three. I've done tobacco, I've done alcohol, and I've done marijuana, Tom. Guess what? Marijuana's the least of the three, pal.
What about,
Wake up to that. How many people smoke pot and go home and beat their wives up? How many people drink and go home and beat their wives up? Let's